Welcome to the Chapter 2.3 overview, Exchange in the Indian Ocean. We had a previous chapter in this unit about the Silk Roads, and there's one coming up about trans-Saharan trade, and this one is focusing on the Indian Ocean. So for the essential question, this is pretty clearly a causation question. It says what are the causes and effects of the growth of networks of exchange after 1200, and how did environmental knowledge support that expansion? For me, to be honest, this is a little specific. There's more in this chapter than just environmental stuff. And the other thing I'll point out, as I said earlier, is that we are talking about the Indian Ocean. And so when they say growth of networks of exchange, we'll be focusing on this one in this particular chapter. Okay, so for some relevance here, this map that you can see is shipping lanes around 2012 or so, and you can see they're quite extensive. So we see this phrase made in China an awful lot, and I don't know if we stop and think how it gets here. And so this is kind of a reminder of how things get here. So the point is that our modern life really relies on global shipping, and that the patterns that are used that we see here on this map were actually established beginning centuries ago. And we're going to see that in the 12, 13, 1400s, trade became more extensive and more globalized. And of course, as this map here shows us, it's even more global than it was in the 1400s. We'll talk about this later, but the big difference between, let's say, 1400s and 1600s is the transatlantic trade. So this area here is kind of blocked off from Afro-Eurasia. So we're going to be looking at Indian Ocean trade today, which will be down kind of in that area. So now for context, we have some ideas here. So the prompt is up here. So again, it's causes and effects of growth of networks of exchange. I started by thinking about this year 1200 and kind of going back a little bit before the year 1200. And I came up with this list over here. So I knew that there were previous trade relationships, that Islam was very much devoted to trade, and that China, going back to the Song dynasty, had a strong economy and that there was this demand for goods. And I also remember from the previous chapter that a little bit after 1200, the Mongols begin to control the land route to Asia. So I looked at my success criteria here that I need to describe and explain my context and make sure that I'm not putting anything in there that should be in the essay. And I came up with this statement down below here. So this part about China's economic, I'm not going to read it to you, but China's economic strength, demand for goods like silk, Mongol control of the Silk Roads route, Islamic traders, previously existing Indian Ocean, build on the pre-existing relationships. That's all, to me, kind of number one, this idea of describing specific details. And then these connections intensify after 1200, leading to the growth of the Indian Ocean trade network is my number two, a little bit of a connection for what do these things up here that I talked about have to do with what I'm talking about in this particular section. And I know it says an essay here, but I was just using this as an example. Okay, so one thing I want to point out is the way that this is organized over here. So we have our main topic over here. We're starting with the causes. And remember, the network of exchange we're talking about here is Indian Ocean. There's a more specific focus for us here about transportation technology and commercial practices. And then over here, I've got the more specific stuff that we'll be looking at. So we're going to start off here with the spread of Islam, and a reminder that it begins on the Arabian Peninsula. Here's Mecca right here, which is the spiritual home of Islam, and that Islamic traders begin to extend their influence and trade through the Red Sea here, down the coast of East Africa, and then really throughout all of these red lines. Muhammad had been a merchant himself, so you might remember that Islam was a particularly merchant-friendly religion. So a lot of what we'll be talking about here, not everything, but a lot of the trade that is happening is facilitated by Islamic traders. So one of the things that it talks about in our list down here is new trading cities. And the one the book focuses on is called Calicut. It's right here on the west coast of India. And you can see there's some lines going directly to it. So Calicut was an important meeting place for merchants coming from the east over here and the west over here. And you can see that it's pretty much at the center of this trade. The book chose to focus on Calicut. It could have talked about really any of these other places. We'll talk about Zanzibar in a little bit. So it's not that Calicut is the only city, the only important one, it's just our example. And so what Calicut does is helps to create the infrastructure that you need in order to have trade. So ports, roads to get goods from the interior of India to the ports and then in the opposite direction, and places for people to stay, marketplaces where the trading can happen. So that's really why the city is really kind of a cause. You could say, one of the things we'll be talking about in this video is that cause and effect can sometimes be interchangeable. So a person could say, if it wasn't for the trade, Calicut wouldn't exist. So the existence of Calicut is an effect of the trade. What we're focusing on here is the manner in which Calicut helps the trade to expand. And that's probably because, of our essential question up here, because that's really what we're focusing on. The other thing we talk about here is a demand for specialized products. And these are specific things that people wanted. So over here in India, you can see our list. We have like cotton and pepper. And cotton is really the big one for India. That is probably the #1 good in demand at this time. And again, that's going all over this region. From Southeast Asia, we have the Spice Islands. So this kind of whole area down here, modern day Indonesia and a little bit of the Malaysian Peninsula, are known as the Spice Islands. And they're known for the spices that we see over here. So nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves. They're very valuable. They're worth a lot of money. And there's a huge demand for them during this time period. Over in East Africa, we have the slave trade, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then we also have gold. We talked about that when we looked at Zimbabwe being over here. So we have gold and slaves coming from East Africa. Over in China, we have silk. And in Southwest Asia, figs is an example of a crop that was in high demand. So again, if we're looking at causes, one of the reasons that these things are so important is because they drive demand for the trade. So on this slide, we have the same setup here. Everything over here is exactly the same, except down here, we're looking at the East African slave trade. And so the book points out that we're used to, probably because of US history, thinking of the slave trade as being what's more of a Central and West African slave trade. And after 1492, Portuguese slave traders are going to begin to seize slaves from, it's a little bit off the map here, from the west coast of Africa and then send them towards the Americas. In this slave trade, at their destination, slaves filled a variety of roles. Sometimes they would labor in the port as kind of captive labor. Sometimes they would be household servants. Sometimes they were even soldiers. And it does point out that the living conditions were a little bit better for victims of the East African slave trade than they were for slavery in the Americas. So I thought we'd take a minute here and look at the question why. So as I mentioned earlier, these 3 columns here are getting more specific as we move to the right here. And one of the ways that we can think about analysis, and I always like to ask myself, I always like to start with the question why. That's a lot of the time really what we're looking at with analysis. So one thing I could look at, it says here, increased transportation technology and commercial practice led to an increased volume of trade. I can think this way and ask myself, why did those things cause the growth of networks of exchange? Then I can look at something like Calicut or the demand for the products, and I can ask myself, why did those things expand the geographical range of existing trade routes? So that's kind of what we're looking at here. So we started with the spread of Islam. So why is it that the spread of Islam helped to expand the trade? And part of that is a communication. When you have more and more Islamic traders, there becomes a common language. That would be Arabic, and also a common religion. So even though you're looking at East Africa, India, Southeast Asia, you have people beginning to speak the same language and having the same customs, which facilitates communication and trade. Another thing that happens is, because of the religious beliefs of Islam, what we mentioned about Muhammad being a merchant, that encourages trade as well because it's considered to be a devout thing to do. For the cities, I mentioned this earlier, so those ports and infrastructure help to support the trade. And the job of a city is also to make trade more efficient. Record keeping, marketplaces, things like that. And anytime you see something like efficiency, that's going to help expand the trade. And then the demand for specialized products, this is pretty straightforward, but the more things you're producing, because there's a higher demand for them, right? Like everybody wants cotton, so let's make more cotton fabric. You're going to sell more goods, and that means you're going to have more business, which means the trade is expanding. So you can't have expanding trade without expanding demand. So the point of that section, when we were talking about the silk, the porcelain, the cotton, all those things, is that as the demand grows, the trade grows along with it. Now we're having more of a technology focus as we look at, again, we're still on the causes of expanded exchange, but now we're looking at technology. So this has changed a little bit. We have innovations in previously existing transportation and commercial technologies. And what we're going to start with is the compass and the astrolabes. The compass we talked about in a previous section. It was also used on land. The Chinese developed the compass. The original compass was a needle floating in a bowl of water. And that was possible to use on land. You would take a bowl, put some water in it, and plop the needle in there. But of course, it's not going to work on the open ocean with the waves. So the Chinese invented the compass, and Arabic merchants developed this sealed compass that worked on the ocean. The astrolabe is a device that helps you determine latitude. So it's not exactly a straight line like we see here, but it is more efficient and really helps traders get to their ports faster. The alternative is to follow the coastline like this. Because if you don't have the compass and the astrolabe, you can't navigate in the open ocean. So this is obviously much faster. The other thing we have are ship designs, these guys over here. And some of these we've also talked about earlier. The lateen sail is this triangular shaped sail right here. It is more maneuverable in the wind. You can actually sail into the wind with a triangular sail much more efficiently than you can with a square sail. This ship is called the dhow, and that is partly important because it had more cargo. And so again, if you can carry more goods, you're going to expand trade. And then it's not shown on the map, but you know that there's a rudder at the back that helps to steer the ship. And these course corrections that we were talking about earlier, you can't really do without a rudder. That's called the stern rudder. So our analysis down here is that if you can carry more goods and sail more directly, then you're going to increase business. You're going to get there faster with more stuff. So again, the dhow, the ship itself, is the more goods, and the get there more directly would be compass, astrolabe, lateen sail, rudder. So one more topic we're looking at is the environmental factors and kind of environmental knowledge. So it says the role of environmental factors in the development of networks of exchange. So these patterns show that there are seasonal directions of winds, and in order to leave the coastline, you needed to understand that. So traders began to realize that they could plan on, in this part of the world, loading up with a lot of goods and then bringing them to East Africa at a certain time. So again, over here, that's going to help speed up the journey. You're going to have more goods delivered, and you're going to expand trade. So again, we have another one of these sections where the unit guide talks about this as a cause, and the book talks about it as an effect. So we've got 3 examples here, and the first one we're going to talk about is the states along the Swahili coast. That is down here. So there's a couple of examples. Zanzibar is one that was mentioned in your book, and also Mombasa. And these cities traded important things in high demand, like ivory, gold, and slaves, to Arab traders. So the Arab traders, having mastered the oceans again, would take them and deliver them throughout the region, perhaps all the way across here, perhaps up along the Red Sea to here. And the money from that trade helped bring a lot of wealth to these Swahili cities. And they were quite advanced for their time. For instance, a lot of the buildings in that area had been made of clay, and there were buildings made in places like Zanzibar out of stone. Next, we have an Indian kingdom called Gujarat, which is right here on the west coast of India. And this is one of the key ports in the trade between the East and West, just like Calicut was, as we discussed earlier. They help facilitate trade by organizing production and by taxing trade and the use of seaports. So again, following that role that we talked about cities playing, also was played by a larger state. And they became so wealthy that at the time period, maybe in the 1400s, they were wealthier than a lot of European states. And the last one is the Sultanate of Malacca. And this is marked as the Strait of Malacca, but the Sultanate of Malacca is in this general region right here. So this is the strait. This is the fastest way to get up here to East Asia, and particularly China. Remember how in demand their goods were. And this was an Islamic government. So it is a sultanate. And whenever you see sultanate, that's probably going to be an Islamic government. So we'll just do that. They impose fees on ships that pass through the strait, and they use that money to organize trade in the same sort of way with ports and harbors and roads. They also expanded into Southeast Asia in this direction and towards the Malay Peninsula up here. and they pretty much controlled the trade in this whole region until they were conquered by the Portuguese in about 1511. That's a 5. 1511. Okay, so now we're on to effects of the exchange, and this is kind of cultural. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've tried to mirror the colors that match the theme for your highlighting in some of these slides here. And now we're looking at something called a diasporic community. And a diaspora is a spreading of people. So if people from the Arabian Peninsula tend to move somewhere in large numbers, that's known as a diaspora. So we'll look at some examples of that. And the cultural effect here is bringing their traditions into the places where they visit. And there being kind of a two-way exchange. So person one travels to region number two, and there's really an exchange of both of those goods. So we have three examples. Here's Persia, and here's Arabia. So by this time, the Persians are primarily Islamic. So we talk about Muslim traders in here. And there are a lot of traders that move down here to East Africa. So it's kind of one kind of diaspora that goes in that direction. A second diaspora is coming from China and going down to Southeast Asia. So this is sort of number two in terms of people moving down there in that direction. And then number three, this is the Malaysian Peninsula. So the people who live here are known as Malay, going into the Indian Ocean basin, particularly to what is now Sri Lanka, and setting up their community there. So let's just talk briefly about this process over here. When traders move to these places, they settle a lot of the time. So when we talk about diaspora, we're saying, an Arabic trader, maybe they live near this seaport, now they live down here. Let's say they live in Zanzibar or something. And so they live there and they intermarry in a lot of cases, and they introduce their own culture. So there might be a Muslim trader who marries a woman from East Africa, and they have children, and those children are raised as Muslim. And that's one of the ways that these cultures kind of move around. And there's a good vocabulary word that is related to this process, which is diffusion. And diffusion is really just the process of culture moving from one place to another because of these kinds of contacts between different cultures. So now we're looking at, again, another effect, and this has to do with the transfer of technology and culture, and we're focusing on a man named Zheng He, who is a Chinese admiral, over 6 feet tall. Some reports even guess that he maybe have been 7 feet tall, and he led a fleet of ships over a course of 7 voyages throughout the region. And just to give you a sense of the superiority of Chinese technology and economic growth, we talked about how important, how powerful China was at this time. This right here is one of Zheng He's ships that he took on his voyages. And to scale, this is one of Christopher Columbus's ships. About almost 100 years later, Christopher Columbus sails in one of these guys, and Zheng He had a whole fleet of these. Okay, so let's look at some of the specifics about these voyages. There were 7 total, and they have different colors here on the map, and this is a nice, helpful timeline, and they kind of overlap in places, so it's a little maybe hard to follow, but you get the general idea that this is kind of, he really sailed throughout Southeast Asia, and eventually all the way to India and all the way to East Africa. These voyages helped to establish a greater presence of China in the trade network. One of the ways that he spread the culture was he built mosques in places that he went to. Zheng He was a Muslim. The fact that we have an Islamic admiral in China at this time is a reminder of, again, the diffusion of culture. And Islam came to China in a couple of ways. One is through Indian Ocean trade routes, and one is through the overland Silk Roads trade route. And remember, both of those trade routes have been going on for a long time period. So here we are in about the 1400s, but this isn't new. It's just expanding over this time period. So there's been trade happening in those two networks for probably 1,000 years by this time. Zheng He also brought Chinese traditions. He built Chinese temples in places that he visited. And because of the impressiveness of these voyages, he also introduced some of that technology we talked about, like the compass and the astrolabe, because people wanted to know how he did what he did and how he got where he got. In China, there was some suspicion of these voyages because Confucianism is really focusing on a simple life that's based in agriculture. And a continuity for Chinese history, for a long time of it at least, is that they don't seem to be particularly interested in going out and looking for things around the world. The Chinese are used to people coming to them, and they don't really think they need anything else. So this was kind of an unusual time period in Chinese history where they're actively seeking contact with the outside world and sending their own traders out. For most of these trade networks, most of the history of them, people are visiting China, and China is saying, if you want to buy our stuff, you can come get it. That's fine with us. So after a fairly short amount of time, the emperor who began the voyages passed away, and his son ended them and recalled them, and China was kind of ended this direct presence. So these trading posts that they had established in all these places kind of went back into the control of the local people. And it's kind of interesting to note what history would have been like if China had had full-scale control of this region, because we'll see this. But not too long after this, the Portuguese are going to arrive in this region and be able to conquer a lot of the people doing the trading. But as you showed you on that map before, I'm not sure if they would have been able to conquer the Chinese. So that's kind of a what if in history in terms of the whole European age of exploration. And we'll talk maybe about that more when we get to that time in history. Okay, so now we're looking at our timeline. There's not a lot of dates in here. A lot of the stuff we talked about, again, is ongoing, just kind of after 1200 kind of stuff. So it's hard to put a date on something like the compass or the growth of the Swahili city-states or the fact that they traded gold. So we just have a few. We have the dates for the Sultan of Malacca. Remember, that's that trading city in Southeast Asia that controls the important strait. We have those voyages of Zheng He we just talked about, and the Sultanate of Gujarat, which is that city in western India that was kind of at the center of trade between the East and the West. So just to wrap up, there were two parts, remember? We said this was a causation question, and there were causes and effects. So we're going to start with the causes, and then we'll get to the effects. And I would say there's more going on with causes than there is with effects. This shouldn't say Mongol conquest. Sorry about that. That's a mistake. So we'll cross that off. So these are the causes right here. Okay, these guys are this. So again, a growing demand for products is going to cause the trade to grow. Islam helping to facilitate trade, partly for religious reasons, but also because it facilitates communication between people. Being able to get places with that technology, like the compass and the astrolabe, you can go back and review and find out that there were more. The knowledge of the monsoon winds to help get goods where they need to go, and the role that the cities and the states played in helping to organize and facilitate that trade. And then for effects, we have these diasporic communities, the fact that the Arab and Persian cultures, the Chinese, the Malay cultures get spread to other parts of Asia and settled, and also to East Africa. And then the fact that the voyages of people like Zheng He helped to transfer culture. And one point we should make about this is that this is not the only time that happened. Every time an Islamic trader is trading, he is also spreading his culture. And remember, Islam spreads throughout the Indian Ocean region with this trade network. So again, we're kind of blurring the line a little bit between causes and effects. If you were doing an essay like this or an analysis of your own, as long as you clearly define and have some analysis, it's okay if something that you use as a cause, somebody else would use as an effect. So that's your chapter 2.3 overview. Happy studying.